So good morning, Dr. Jesse Ehrenfeld. So happy to have you join us today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Participating in our international conference on medical device standards and regulation. Keynote speaker this morning, President-elect of the American Medical Association, practicing anesthesiologist, and probably a whole lot more. What else should we add to that list?
Well, I live in Milwaukee. I see patients every week, and at the end of the day, that's what this is all about. It's making sure that the patients that we serve, that we care for, are able to benefit from technology standards is such a critical piece of what we're trying to do. Absolutely.
And the topic this morning was AI, artificial intelligence, and really the intersection of that with the clinical practice, some of the opportunities and the rest that are there. But before we dive into the details, where are we today? What's the current state of AI in medical practice?
Yeah, so the AMA has done serial surveys over time for the last 6 years, understanding physician adoption of AI tools, digital health tools, lots of things in the marketplace. And what we continue to see, and we just released some survey results a month or so ago from 2022, is that adoption continues to increase. 1 in 5 physicians today says that they're using some type of AI-enabled tool in their practices, in their facilities, in their hospitals. Now, most of it's back-end office systems.
Billing.
It's billing, it's supply chain,
Yep.
it's those sort of operations-focused things. But what physicians tell us is that they see the promise. They want these tools to help make better decisions every day for their patients. We know it's possible because we experience it, right? I experienced it online on Amazon,
right.
with recommendations for things that algorithms in the back end are helping with decisions. We know that there's a possibility there, but we've got a long way to go between that vision of what is possible and where we are today. And the regulatory framework, the standards work, getting payment and coverage right is going to be essential to making sure that we have a smooth landing.
Right. So what are some of you talked about 1 in 10. What are some of the areas where the AI is actually in the clinical workflow? Are there some examples of that you can share where AI is already making a difference in patient care? And then maybe we'll talk a little bit about the challenges associated with that.
Yeah, there are only a handful of products that have been gone through the regulatory pathway that are approved. There's an autonomous diabetic retinopathy detection tool that does screening. It's very effective, very efficient, very well adopted in the marketplace. And we'll see more tools like that where there are image recognition kinds of things. There are more and more products where algorithms are doing overreads of images, of scans, of things like that, helping to identify structures. Endoscopy, looking in real time to do a double check kind of maneuver. Those are the kinds of tools that we're seeing being brought into practice. But right now it's not clear what that's going to mean in the long term in terms of how we can use those tools to augment the capabilities and capacities of physicians and other healthcare workers.
And you talked a bit about this morning the trust issue. Not only do clinicians need to trust and want to adopt this technology, but patients as well.
Trust is really important, and it's a foundational issue. Patients are much less willing to trust an algorithm that they can't see, they can't talk to, they don't know where the data came from when it comes to their own body, their own health care. Even if in surveys we tell them that the AI is going to get it right more often, it'll be more cost effective, people are less willing to buy it, less willing to pay for it, less willing to trust it because of those issues. And that's something that we're going to have to work through, making sure that we've got reliable standards, making sure that we've got appropriate transparency around the product development lifecycle is going to be essential and at the core of making sure that we can establish that trust and maintain it over time for these kinds of digital health tools, particularly the ones that are AI-enabled.
I must be the outlier here. I would be ready to go tomorrow. I'll be patient one on some of this stuff. Give it a try. So, Joe, this ties back to the standards development process, and I know you're co-chair of our AI committee.
Yes.
Right, and a lot of work has started on that front. So maybe dive in a little bit about current state of the standards and regulatory framework.
Well, I think that's a good point. You talked about some of the barriers to reaching the greatest heights of use of AI and appropriate use. You talked about the difficulty in trusting it, and that's a barrier. But there are also barriers in terms of enabling that trust or ensuring that trust, because the regulatory structures we have now are not always adapted for something like AI or other digital health technologies. Can you talk a little bit about that and where those problems are? And
Yeah, no, I think the FDA and other agencies appropriately have recognized that the existing medical device regulatory framework does not work for digital health. It does not work for an AI algorithm
because of the rate of change.
Learning, right? If an algorithm is consuming data. And every week there's an update, and it's giving you a self-learning, self-corrected result. You can't put that through a typical regulatory framework pathway. It doesn't work. So we've got to be able to rethink the pathways, but it's complicated, right? Because what's the level of evidence required for an approval? How do we talk about transparency? What sort of explainability behind how the algorithm's working should be required to make sure that we know it's working and that we have the confidence and the trust of the person who's using it, like me, the physician, or the patient, who's going to receive the benefit of the care. In a traditional product, or a drug, a biologic, a device, there's a prospective trial. I can see table 1 in the paper, the demographics, the characteristics, who is in the study. That doesn't necessarily translate to an AI-enabled medical device or digital tool. So we need to sort of figure out how to navigate that. AAMI's been at the center of trying to, do some of that standards work through the AI committee, which I've been appreciative to be a co-chair of. But these things there are a lot of unanswered questions.
That's a great discussion about explainability and understanding. So obviously, if we're going to use AI, we need to understand what it's recommending or what it's doing and have faith in that. And it's obviously hard because AI can outthink us sometimes. Beyond that, there are also risks of AI because although if we're going to trust AI, we must have trust that it's not going to do something that's damaging or something that's not going to actually be helpful. And risk, you talked about how the AI committee at AAMI is addressing risk for AI. Can you talk a little bit about risk and the approach towards that?
So the risk framework for AIs is not foundationally different than in other medical device products. But understanding how do we mitigate it, how do we manage it, and what is the regulatory framework around it has to be different. And I think that's been globally recognized, for at least the last 5 years through a lot of work that AAMI and others have led. At the end of the day, we have seen algorithms that have had some wild misfires, very publicly difficult demonstrations of AI gone bad. Optum had an algorithm that was designed to comb through millions of patient records to understand, who is a high utilizer and who could benefit from interventions, who could benefit from some additional care and love from their care team. And it turned out that their algorithm was driven by race. And if you substituted a white patient for a black patient, suddenly it recommended an intervention. If you substituted a black patient for a white patient, it didn't.
Because of previous patterns
that
of
was
consumption.
A reflection of the existing healthcare environment where we know there are access gaps, we know there's bias. We can't allow AI systems to exacerbate bias like that. So that's a pretty novel risk tied to the data set that's developing an algorithm. In that case, that's not a medical device product, but it's a telling example of how even with the best of intentions, right, even with a large data set, these things can go off the rails pretty quickly in insidious ways, right? It's not necessarily something that will be obvious to detect. And so we've got to be pretty proactive when we think about the regulatory framework, the approval process, to make sure that we don't allow insidious bias, challenges, or risks to infuse themselves into the care delivery system as these new products come into the marketplace.
Because if AI is built upon assumptions that are wrong, it's not going to function, right?
Exactly.
And we don't always know when our assumptions are wrong.
Correct.
So it
Correct.
needs to be self-correcting in some ways.
Correct. And you even look at the recent news in appropriate attention around pulse oximetry. And that technology, developed in the 70s, brought in the marketplace, it is critical. I use it every time I see patients as an anesthesiologist. But we know that it was not validated in people of color with dark skins, and there are some real challenges with that technology that's been in the marketplace for decades, not working as expected in people with dark skin tones. If you go back and you look at the studies, it's kind of obvious why we ended up with this problem. But if we're not out ahead of that with the data that's going into these AI development processes, we'll end up with similar results, I'm sure.
Okay. So is it fair to say that AI magnifies both opportunities and risks? As I'm listening to you two talk about this, that's what it sounds like.
I think it does. And look, I'm a technology guy. I've got 20 years of informatics development work under my belt. I love it. I live it. I breathe it. I see what the opportunity is. I was in the operating room yesterday until late last night taking care of patients, and I know that there's subtle signals. I've got 43 data parameters coming at me, 9 continuous, waveforms that I am constantly looking at while I'm, doing other stuff like giving blood and drawing up medicines and all the things that happen in acute care surgical environments. I know that there are subtle things that I miss. Everybody misses. We're humans. There have to be ways that algorithms, that machines can make me a better, more effective, more proactive deliverer of care. And I know that's possible. But to get there is going to require a really strong regulatory environment, a lot of trust between patients, clinicians, developers to get this right.
Okay. As the president-elect for AMA, how can clinicians help that? Because if there's going to be trust, if we're going to make sure we have the right assumptions, it seems pretty critical to have the people that are actually at the bedside delivering care involved in the process, not just in using it, but also in helping develop it, helping ensure that it's being regulated and controlled correctly. So
yeah, well, we have lived the pain of physicians, clinicians, other healthcare end users being an afterthought in the product development lifecycle. Whether it's the pain of the electronic health record, that these are billing systems that got brought into clinical environments and suddenly at the centerpiece of everything we do, but weren't designed for the end user. We can't allow that to happen with these digital health tools, with AI-enabled products, and as we do this, we've got to ensure that we don't lose the trust of the public, that we don't lose confidence in the tools that are coming into the marketplace. We live in a very fragile world today where trust in science, in regulated products, in advice from government agencies is increasingly questioned. And in the worst sort of circumstances, deliberately ignored. And we've got to make sure that there isn't an opening to exacerbate that problem through whatever regulatory framework, whatever standards approach ultimately comes forward for some of these new digital health tools.
So I want to ask a bit about that, sort of what's next in standards development, what's the AI committee working on, but let me seed that with sort of a question to talk about the future. Is real-world evidence a larger part of this? Faster access to real-world evidence, faster access to signaling, because a lot of these tools are focused at pop health kind of data. And so it seems to me the only way to validate them is going to be at that level. Is that part of the solution?
Well, figuring out, what do we require pre-market and what do we require post-market surveillance is an open question. But 12 years is cited, as the time between development of an innovation, the time that it actually hits a patient.
12 years.
12 years. That is too long.
A long time.
Now, fortunately, we didn't have to wait that long for a COVID vaccine. Mm-hmm. In under a year, that technology, that platform was able to bring that important tool and technology into the marketplace because of tremendous advances in sciences and technologies. We need that speed. AI can enable that speed. Big data can enable these things to happen to make it possible for my patients, my mother, my son to benefit from technologies that we know should be available that are coming online. But we've got to make sure that we've got the regulatory framework to support it.
Right. So what's next? What's happening on the AI committee now? What are some things we can talk about sort of publicly, Joe? Or
Well, there's a lot, and the AI committee has been very active with a lot of stakeholder engagement work to try to make sure that there's a broad understanding of some of these foundational issues as the standards development framework comes forward from the FDA, and there's an active rule under comment through the Digital Center for Excellence. I know that AAMI and the AI committee will continue to engage, and I think one of the really important roles that AAMI continues to play is as a convener. And so I certainly, at the AMA, we're grateful that the AMA is able to be a part of those conversations to make sure that the physician voice, the voice of the end user, is a part of the product development lifecycle, whether it's on the standards end or other pieces.
Excellent. Joe, any final thoughts?
Oh, no, I think we appreciate your thoughts about the AMA. I want to say from an AMA standpoint, we've been extremely gratified to have the AMA involved in that committee, as well as the foundational work we've done with BSI around clarifying some of the needs for artificial intelligence. And that's an ongoing process and will likely be ongoing for some time. But thank you.
Well, I have to say the foundational work that AAMI and BSI did with the release of the 2020 white paper really set the stage for what are these issues and how do we need to think about them. And that's been an important roadmap that sort of set up the now AAMI AI committee's work, some of the engagement with the FDA. And again, it's a promising future, and we've all got to be at the table, and that's why I'm grateful for the partnership with AAMI.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much. We really appreciate your time today.
Sure. Thank you.
Thanks.